So I went to the Van Gogh immersion experience in Hollywood last week. I was all set on what I was going to talk about this week, and then I discovered um, this immersion experience where you see the paintings all the way up the wall. They're really, really bright. They're really exuberant. It's very, very cool. Now there may be a few short videos with slight flashes of light. You can hear my dogs in the background. I apologize, but they'll be quiet in a minute. So yes, Caravaggio was also known to be very, very impetuous and stab somebody in the groin after a tennis tournament. They now think it was not so much about the game, but it was about a woman. Okay, but in any case, Caravaggio certainly known for this really, really bold personality. Might they both Van Gogh and Caravaggio, there's a very good possibility they were suffering from white lead poisoning. Would that cause them to act weird? Yes. Erratic? Yes. Even kind of crazy? Absolutely. I'm going to give you a little bit of the features of Impressionism. Please note this carefully. Van Gogh is a post-impressionist, not an impressionist. So the impressionist, I'm going to give you a little background because we really can't talk about post-impressionism before we talk about impressionism. So generally used a pastel palette, often painted outdoors and plein air. This is John Singer Sargent painting his friend Monet in the woods. And he's painting in more of a impressionist style than an academic style because he's painting his impressionist friend Monet. John Singer Sargent, do I consider him an impressionist? No, not really. Was he influenced by Impressionism? Yes. But Monet, Rouen Cathedral, is also about the changing effects of light. If I look at Rouen Cathedral in the morning, it's going to look entirely different in the late afternoon. It will have changing values of light. So, Madame Monet on the sofa, could he paint academically? Yes, he could. Often these works are asymmetrical. They're influenced by photography, which was coming out in the mid 1830s, right around there is the early photography, and then it gets a little progressive as time goes on. Supposedly, Renoir and others avoided the use of black, used dark navy. That's true for the most part, but you do occasionally see one. I think of one in particular of two young women in black in a Renoir work. It was right after I finished reading a book said he absolutely positively never used black. And then I looked and he used black. Not as a signature style, undoubtedly. Cassatt, Girl in Armchair, 1878, smack dab in the middle of Impressionism. Brushwork loose, sketchy, painterly, and she's got the little dog on the chair, exhausted. The child's thrown herself back, and it's interesting cropping like a picture. And then we also have Manet, not Monet, Manet's Bar at the Folies Bergère. This is not a history painting. It's not a mythology painting. They're painting modern life. Degas, brushy, impressionistic. He was not crazy about the impressionist label. He'd probably be annoyed with me right now, but he fits. Now, he is painting more indoors than outdoors, although he did paint horses and circuses as well. Morisot's The Cradle looks unfinished, not academic, but also looks gorgeous. It's very much part of Impressionism. And Berthe Morisot, of course, is a woman artist like Mary Cassatt, who again are both painting in this manner. Now, Claude Monet wanted you to look at more than one of these images. He wanted you to look at several of these images at the same time so you could understand the way he was seeing the world, the changing and fleeting and fugitive effects of light. And so you don't often see a bunch of them together, largely because they sell for millions. And so oftentimes that's just not possible. So you go to the Getty and you look at snowy effect haystacks and you're like, oh, this is gorgeous. Oh, this is beautiful. It's not really exciting unless it's with other ones. That was the point. That was the whole point. So here's an example of academic. Here's an example of Impressionism, this one's finely painted, small brush. This one is loosely painted. And this one is more about, modern style. In fact, it's called La Parisienne, which was the style. And so was Renoir's palette as pastel as Monet's? No. But even so, you see the brushy effect. Now, originally, this actually had some details in the back, but he painted them out. I think the idea was to focus more on that pretty female, and she was an actress. This is by Vincent van Gogh. This is Quarry at Montmartre. There's a lot of letters there, but it just sounds like Montmartre. And this is 1880s. And so Vincent van Gogh painted roughly 9 or 10 years, not very long at all. And in that 10 years, he was pretty, 9 or 10 years, depends on the book. In that time period, he was extremely prolific. He was producing a huge number of works. Some have said that it's almost the same number as people who have been painting their whole life. So he often went walking around the area, and so this is an image of the more underdeveloped area of Montmartre. So he was exposed to the Impressionist, Post-Impressionist, Henri Toulouse-Lautrec, and this is 1880s. So Montmartre is kind of an old part of Paris. It has the Moulin Rouge, the red windmill. A lot of people, if they go to Paris, this is the area they want to go to, especially if they love art. They want to go see Café Society. They want to see where these artists hung out. They want to see all those details. And so this is the Moulin in Montmartre, and it shows two of the windmills. At a moment in time, there were a number of windmills, but not in more modern times. So this is the work of Toulouse-Lautrec. He, of course, is hanging out in the nightlife. He is hanging out with these prostitutes. These are his friends. He's having a good time. And he was a man of short stature. He was under 5 feet tall. He was not a quote-unquote little person. He did have some growth issues, probably because he broke his legs and probably interfered with the growth plates. And so that's probably why he was under the norm. But again, he was not born a little person, but he was certainly little in general. His parents had great hopes for him to become a lawyer, but they felt that at under 5 feet tall, that was not going to happen. He needed to have a more imposing presence. Now, I don't know about you. I know of a number of shorter people that have an imposing presence. It has nothing to do with their height. But even so, they were fairly supportive of him being an artist. They weren't particularly supportive of him drinking too much and hanging around in the bars at all time, but indeed, Henri Toulouse-Lautrec did not live to be very old as well because he was a bit of a partier. Vincent van Gogh, House of Auvers. This is an 1890s landscape, active brushwork, deeper colors. And I show this to you not particularly in order. This is a late work, but I want you to see the contrast between Impressionism, Post-Impressionism. The colors are much deeper, expressionistic. It's a landscape. He did produce a number of landscapes, certainly landscapes and sunflowers and night scenes. That's really what he's known for. He did do a few portraits, many self-portraits. The bottom you have an actor, William Dafoe, who played Vincent van Gogh. And again, he painted a number of these self-portraits. He didn't have to pay himself. Models you have to pay. So here's where it gets interesting. Anna, Cornelia, and Theodorus, he was a pastor, Van Gogh had a child named Vincent Willem, stillborn exactly a year before Vincent van Gogh was born. The mother never really completely accepted replacement Vincent over original Vincent. These sort of things happen, and for whatever reason, she didn't have the same relationship with Vincent van Gogh that she did with her other children, a distance. But they did the family did acknowledge a love of nature, going on walks, the enjoyment of plants and flowers, and they were, again, also very, very religious. Dutch Reform. And so Vincent was a family name, and I understand that oftentimes when a family name like that, the child dies, then yes, the subsequent child is named the same thing. But to have the exact same name on a headstone, where he could literally go for a walk and see it daily if he wanted to, and so it would be very difficult for a child to live up to those kinds of expectations. But he was the oldest child of a number of them. Uh, Oddly, another artist has a similar biographical note. Salvador Dali was the second Salvador. His brother died before he was born, um, uh, at 22 months. So he was even told he was this brother reincarnated at a young age. So it's not the exact same story because, again, the child died young, but and certainly doesn't share the exact same birthday, which that's a little freaky. But certainly it is indeed confusing, and I think it'd be confusing for a child. It said that around 5 years old, he was being told that he was the reincarnation of this child. So if Salvador Dali turned out a little quirky or strange, maybe that's why. So in a letter to his sister, Van Gogh wasn't enormously happy with the painting of their mother, Anna Cornelia Van Gogh. He'd written to his brother, "I am doing a portrait of mother for myself." Mind you, they didn't have a lot of pictures and things like that. There would have been some. "I cannot stand the colorless photograph, and I'm trying to do one in harmony in color as I see her in my memory." And you can see it's done pretty well. You can really, really see a resemblance. Now, she wasn't green. She looks green now. When you go to the Norton Simon, you're like, why did he paint her green? Was that like a symbol of fertility or something? No, it is simply that she faded. And so the red was not stable. So uh, he actually would say to anyone that would talk about his family that his parents' marriage was exemplary. He was very smart. He spoke 4 languages fluently, reading and writing, and he could actually speak 6. He refused to learn Latin, which he needed to know in order to become a pastor and follow in his father's footsteps. There'd been a number of pastors in this family, and indeed he refused. He said, "Why should I learn a dead language?" And once he decided something, it was pretty difficult to make him think something else. So this early work actually shows a remarkable amount of skill. He was influenced by the brown tonal features of Rembrandt, interested in their expression, in getting to know these individuals as well. And so he was emotional, lacked self-confidence, had a history of unsuitable romances, prostitutes that he would, try to reform, and also had a tendency to be attracted to sad women, tragic women, widows. Widows were also a thing for him as well. So he went through basically a time where he was trying to find himself, find a career. Early on, he was around 15, 16, depends on the biographer, when he was put out into the work world because his family had fallen on harder financial times. So he's out in the workplace earning, he's no longer going to school, but again, he's picking up languages really well. And he's selling art, did okay with that in general. A teacher, he was again way too intense for teaching. A preacher, again, he didn't go through the full process, so he could not become a full pastor, but he was like a lay minister that would kind of go from area to area. And he had an intensity that made people uncomfortable. Now he was generous. You could ask him for his last loaf of bread and he would share it with you or give it to you for that matter. And certainly he had a respect for the poor, for the working class. And I think you see that in this very, very humble picture of them eating potatoes. And he talks about how, they're eating these potatoes and, and it kind of even reflects the palate of the picture as well. this very, very humble home. And indeed, he even emulated the peasants living like they did and trying to understand the working class. And frankly, they thought he was weird. Yeah, I mean, they just didn't quite understand that he was really simply trying to understand the working class. The shoes reflect this as well. 1887 boots. He did a number of shoes. Shoes indeed do reflect class. Obviously, someone who's very poor has no shoes. If someone has very torn shoes or very worn shoes, that reflects the lower classes. Upper classes, it might be very, very elaborate shoes, very decorative shoes. So miles and miles have been written on these shoes. Are they a woman's shoes? I don't think so. I do think they're probably likely Vincent van Gogh's shoes, but they look small. Well, it's called foreshortening, just the angle that it's painted at, or indeed, maybe he just didn't have huge feet. So these are things that people wonder about. And then you also see it transitioning into, he's also painting in colors. So he starts to also paint in colors. And ultimately, some of his more popular images are very, very Dutch in their blue and their yellows. Blues and yellows and oranges, opposite on the color wheel. And it was a very, very appealing combination. Gorgeous colorist, really. So astoundingly, he actually walked 100 miles in 3 days to visit his sister Anna van Gogh in Welwyn. So, I mean, that's an astounding number. And again, just continuously, practically. And so he was a great walker. He liked to go for walks. I enjoyed nature. And so maybe this is why his shoes look a little worn. 3 pairs of shoes. Again, he produced several of these, but they tend to have this brown tonal quality. A metaphor for going through life, but his peers thought the theme was bizarre. I don't know that people would be struck particularly by it now. We have Andy Warhol who did a number of images of shoes as well. Originally, he did it for a department store, one of his first commissions. So here, again, a number of shoes. And you even have the Dutch-looking shoes in the top corner, 1888. And so, and I often do this. I love this about search engines and being able to look at a number of works all at once. It really gives you a real quick glimpse of the artist's works. So what, one wonders, would Vincent make of all of this? What did he really mean by these shoes? Sometimes shoes are just shoes, and I think that's true, and I think it's also largely true of the sunflowers. Meyer Shapiro, who is an important art historian and art critic, plunged into Van Gogh's correspondence and ephemera and writings, and there was a huge number of letters to Theo that shows that they were not women's shoes, but he was interested in class differences. I definitely think that was the main point. He admired Millet's peasant worker paintings, such as this important work at the Getty. And this is at the Getty in LA. It's a very large canvas. And here you have the poor are idealized a little bit. Van Gogh did make copies of some of Millet's works. He was inspired by it, but often the palette is much more limited, whereas the palette here is a little more colorful than what Van Gogh was doing in the same theme. Millet associated with Romanticism. And again, remember, Vincent van Gogh is later. We call him post-impressionist, expressionist. Now, also, Millet had an interest in showing everyday man, just somebody that you might not even notice otherwise. Sower with the setting sun, he did a number of these. This shows Japonism influence, that strong diagonal, and again, that really active brushwork, and opposite on the color wheel, just absolutely gorgeous. The Sower, 1888, he made more than 30 drawings and paintings on this theme. But in the Christian faith, you sow seeds of faith by spreading the word of God. And so it's an allegory. And so this would have been one of the reasons why this preoccupied him. One of the best loved works in art history, Starry Night. And Starry Night is active, it's gestural, it's expressionistic. There's a lot of yellow. There's some thought that was because he was on digitalis, and digitalis was something that was prescribed for him. Usually, it was something used more for your heart, but again, they were exploring medicine. Medicine was quite different then. And so here you have this beautiful, beautiful active sky. It's gorgeous. He loves cypress trees. That's the main reason this shows up. It's not a death image. Oftentimes in art history, a cypress tree is a symbol of death, but I don't think that's what he was using it as. I think he had an interest in them. He thought they were beautiful. He liked expressing them in paint, so it was an interest. Now this is cropped. You don't see the whole city, but you will. The clip I'm going to show you is actually something from the Hollywood Immersion Experience at the on Van Gogh, and it was in Hollywood, and it was really quite breathtaking. And I recommend these immersion experiences highly. They're pretty cool. So pretty cool, isn't it? The music was great too, very grand, loud too. So early palette, largely earth tones, brown, in the style of a Rembrandt. Later palette, certainly some of the key notable works, lots of blues and yellows and golds. He did use other colors, but again, there are a number of very successful works that are in this palette. Influenced by the Impressionists, definitely, but again, he's a post-impressionist. Opposite on the color wheel is a way to really make colors pop. There's a reason why when you walk in the entrance of Disneyland, you often see purple and yellow pansies. They look awesome together. So he was a remarkable colorist. People tend to either think this is a wonderful, happy image, or some of them see it as a tragic image. It's largely opinion. So here again are another example of a work that has these bold swirling stars, and it also has a little bit more of a cypress tree that almost has a bit of a pine look to it as well. So this is the road to Provence, and the couple just walking down the road. I like this work just as much as I like Starry Night. It's a gorgeous work. It's not a stereotype. Not everybody recognizes it immediately. Starry Night over the Rhone. This is 1888. Often it seems to me, he wrote, night is even more richly colored than day. During the same month of September, he finally realized his obsessive project. And this is from the Musée d'Orsay. And I do tend to always credit my sources so you know exactly where they're coming from. And I avoid Wikipedia. I avoid BuzzFeed. I try to use more academic sources. So occasionally I will find a popular source, but I'll always check it to make sure it's accurate. And so again, this active brush work, I just think it's a gorgeous, gorgeous work. So swirling, vibrant, emotional. Again, I think it's just as beautiful as Starry Night. it doesn't have the same flowing sense to it. It has this stop and start action as far as the brushwork, but he's an incredible colorist. Here's some examples from the exhibition. This beautiful image is a detail or part of Night Cafe or Terrace Cafe. It has a few names. But in any case, I think this is a fairly happy picture. It's bright blues and yellows. Yellow was a happy color for him, generally speaking. Nocturnal scene, Place du Forum in Arles. Again, the same palette of opposite colors. He was pleased with it. I believe that an abundance of gaslight, which after all is yellow and orange, intensifies blue. And so this is Terrace Cafe at night in Arles. You can see what it looked like a couple of years ago and today. And so the Café Tambourin, also called the Café Van Gogh, because that's of course what it's most famous for. Like, I don't think they're going to paint that yellow wall any day soon. Mulberry Tree, 1889. This is a fairly small work. It's very striking. It has a thick impasto, a thick application of paint. It's swirling, it's dynamic, it's active, and again, it looks like a palette knife was certainly used to load it up because it has this thick application of paint. And this is also at the Nortensheim. Here you can see it with the mulberry trees. Now this is a very different night cafe. This is not nearly as happy as the one that was done in yellows and blues. And so this is reds and greens, has that tilt perspective, it's more negative. You don't have the sense that the patrons are particularly happy. You know that it's late at night around basically 12:15. These lights, these gas lights just vibrate. And he wrote about this as well. So we know that for him, red and green tend to be jarring. This tilt perspective, I think, is made to make you feel a bit uncomfortable. In a letter to his brother, he described the Café de Alcazar, where he took his meals, as blood red and dull yellow with a green billiard table in the center. 4 lemon yellow lamps with an orange and green glow. Everywhere there's a clash and contrast of the most disparate reds and greens. The clashing colors were also meant to express the terrible passions of humanity. And so here there would be vagrants, prostitutes, and again, a rather unhappy clientele. Sunflowers, again, this has a lot of paint on it, not as much as Mulberry Tree, but you can see even in the top corner the thick application of paint. I mean, largely his brother was helping him with paints and whatnot, so he would have been going through a lot of paint. So ultimately, his brother encourages people to kind of check on Vincent. Gauguin ends up going to stay with Vincent in Arles. Vincent van Gogh wanted to have an artist community, kind of like Laguna Beach in the early 1920s, right around there. So by 1888, Van Gogh was acting more and more erratic. Ultimately, in a psychotic break, he chases Gauguin down the street, goes home, and mutilates part of his ear, not the entire ear. Then he gifts it to a prostitute friend, Rachel. Guard this object carefully. Now, there is some thought, this is fairly recent, that she actually was a maid in the brothel. Her family had fallen upon hard times and she needed to have a couple jobs. And generally speaking, a young girl didn't want to work in a brothel, but that was what was available to her. Certainly, career choices would be limited. And Paul Gauguin is closely associated with Vincent van Gogh, whom he stayed, but the visit, of course, did not end well. I mean, they got along pretty well, but as soon as Gauguin mentioned that he was going to leave, Van Gogh largely flips out. He saw that this was going to be this new colony, and there was going to be at least a dozen disciples of art. This idea of 12 was also important to him. He liked that idea of it being, it has that Christian tie-in of the 12 disciples. And then here we actually have a portrait of that Gauguin produced, and you have Gauguin's self-portrait in the face, and then you have the red hair of Vincent van Gogh. He did not love this work that Gauguin did, not at all. This idea of this merging of Gauguin and Van Gogh into a portrait of Christ, it didn't really go over too well in his eyes. Bedroom at Arles, most believe that this was generally a positive image for him. It was a positive place for him originally. Now, as time goes, of course, Arles becomes quite different. People became quite distrustful of him because he was behaving so erratically. But I think in general, this is a happier picture. It doesn't have the same strong tilted perspective that you get in the other work. Bedroom at Arles. Again, it's simple. There's not a lot there, but you kind of have the signature, the look of it, and it's very bold. And to me, I think his work looks like he was producing something that should have been produced 20 or 30 years ago, not 1888. I think he was really, really ahead of his time. I think he was really modern, really contemporary, and not well received at all. This was not academic. This wasn't even impressionistic, which was considered kind of out there as well. Here's Vincent's portrait of a chair, and then this is Gauguin, a painting of a chair. It's interesting the difference between Gauguin's simpler chair, and Van Gogh's simpler yellow chair, and then also in contrast, you have Gauguin's more European, more detailed. You have some books. There's a little bit more going on, not quite as simplified as the simple chair with the pipe and the sunflower in the back that you get in Vincent's work. But it's an interesting contrast, this personification of a pair of chairs, essentially. Gauguin also painted this of Vincent van Gogh, and he wasn't delighted with this one either. You know, a lot of people, I don't think they like their photograph and they don't particularly like their painting, but I think it's also interesting that his face is still shaped a little bit more like Gauguin's than Vincent van Gogh's. People are surprised to discover that there is far more than one sunflower painting. There's several. There are 12 of them, 5 are fairly large, and 7 are pretty well known. He painted around 29 to 37 years old. He's the personification of the tragic artistic persona. Tremendous output in these years that he was active. And sunflowers were happy emblems. He wanted to decorate the room for when his friend came to stay. So this was essentially him laying out beautiful flowers for his friend. And yellow was positive. Now, if you were to talk to a decorator, they would say that yellow is a downer for a lot of people. But for whatever reason, for Vincent van Gogh, it was positive. I think it's positive. I have a few yellow walls in my home. I think they energize me. So we all respond to color in different ways. So here is a kind of a cross section of all these different sunflowers. And you can see the scale. You can see the men holding that huge sunflower print in the bottom. And then you see the Gauguin chair right behind on the wall as well. So look at the art. Don't get caught up in the biography only. Look at the art as well. There's all sorts of ideas about what was going on with him. Sometimes malnutrition, he wasn't eating well. And certainly syphilis, uh, a large part of the population had syphilis. It's supposedly as high as 10%. Tinnitus, I think I'm saying that right, if not, whatever. Lead poisoning, epilepsy, Meniere's syndrome. Again, they don't entirely know. And I think that's part of the appeal. We don't entirely know. The art historian Winkelmann was one of the first to question this idea of the artistic personality, the artistic persona. Studying, focus on the art. Do not get caught up so in the biography that you stop looking. Look at the art. This is actually the color wheel that they would have seen in this time period. This is a 19th century example of a color wheel. So he goes into Arles, he enters into a prolific period. His works are infused with yellow. And so some say he had overindulged in absinthe, while another suggests he took too much digitalis. So again, either could have tinted the world with yellow, which is, again, it's an interesting idea. And absinthe, you can purchase in the United States now, but it's a toned down version. Absinthe kind of has the taste of licorice, and it's very, very strong. It's supposedly similar to ouzo. I haven't tried it yet, but one of these days I might. Irises, 1889. So this is Irises, and it's at the Getty. And it's active, lots of movement to it. It's a late work. Some say it's sad, some say it's happy. I see a sense of isolation. I think that one lone white iris is interesting and telling. I think he felt different. I think he felt alone. I think he felt like no one understood him. But then some people say it's joyful, it's gorgeous. He's trying to understand the world. Both readings are right. If I was to write a paper, I would talk about how some people perceive this and some people perceive this, and then I'd have a few of the experts' opinion as well. And then here's a detail of the irises. You can see that as well. So it's filled with melancholy and sadness. I don't know if I get that. Pointing out Van Gogh's stay in the asylum and the lone white flower. On the opposite end, another viewer felt the painting is full of joy. So again, it's okay. It's okay to have both experiences. It's much prettier at the Getty than it is on this screen. He also developed a love of Rubens and Japanese prints, and of course Rembrandt early on. And he was selling art, so he was seeing it. And his brother was involved in the art world as well. So he was going to Paris, and he spent time in Paris, and he was seeing a lot of these important impressionists. He's seen Toulouse-Lautrec's work. He had a nervous temperament, and he could be a difficult companion. That's an understatement. Obsessively painting night and day, even with the candles around the head. That's true. It's hard to believe, but that's true. I mean, you would think that that's just a big accident looking to happen. Now, this particular work is called his Almond Blossoms, and it was a gift to baby Vincent. His brother and Joe Van Gogh had a baby, and Vincent Van Gogh, and in honor of that, he presents them with this gift, which is a gift to the baby, which is shows new growth, shows hope, and he produced a number of them. So again, he did several of these almond blossom trees. And again, it's the ukiyo-e tradition, the floating world. This is the courtesan culture. And so these are the things that he's looking back to Japanese art. It was a fun experience, I have to say. A number of years ago, I did a champagne and painting for a friend of mine whose daughter was getting married, and so it can be done fairly easily. It's loose, it's comfortable, it's enjoyable, especially fun with wine and a little champagne. But in any case, these are done in acrylic, and so but he was experimenting in different palettes. So again, if you're so right now we're all spending a little more time at home. So if you're so moved, paint a Van Gogh. So Flowering Orchard, 1880s. Again, shows Japonism influence, slightly asymmetrical, weighted heavier on one side. The cherry blossoms are after Hiroshige. And again, that interesting cropping, the bold diagonals, these are looking back to Japonism. Alfred Stevens, this is an academic painter. This is an artist that follows the rules, that is academically trained. And Japonism was a term that was coined in the mid-19th century, mid to late 19th century, to describe this craze for Japanese art as they're coming in. Lacquers are coming in, prints are coming in, beautiful fabrics are coming in, and of course they were hugely popular in Europe. And here we have some blue kimonos. There's a number of blue kimonos in art history in the Impressionist. I think that's interesting as well. I have a number of slides with them in these blue prints. And redheads are very popular in art history, maybe because it's color, and artists love color. And certainly it's bright, it's appealing. Also, redheads were viewed with suspicion. Redheads, if you were had red hair, they thought you might be loose. Go figure. So a well-preserved copy of Utagawa Kunisada's A Courtesan from the series Night Cherry Blossoms in the Pleasure Quarter. Van Gogh collected these prints. He had hundreds of them. Many artists were influenced by Japonism, and it's said that, again, he saw them in a cafe on the wall. And so this was very, very influential to him, particularly Kasai Eisen as well. And again, the interesting diagonals, this idea of the Edo district, the courtesans with their kanzashi hairdos. Here reposes Vincent van Gogh and his brother Theo, or Theo if you prefer that pronunciation. And because it was a suicide, he was not interred inside of the cemetery. He was interred outside of the cemetery. That was what was done. 6 months later, his brother was buried next to him, because again, he died relatively shortly after that. And to a certain degree, Vincent van Gogh was also in despair because of his financial difficulty. Theo had a new baby. He had new responsibilities, and really didn't have the extra funds to give Vincent as well. So he was losing an important support as well. I've always thought this kind of looks like a haunted house because of the wavery lines and whatnot, and I still do, but I don't think it was intended to look kind of that dark. It just kind of has that experience. And here you can see a photograph of the church. Now, Vincent van Gogh dies. Theo dies 6 months or so after, and then Joe van Gogh is left with this infant, and not a lot of money and not a lot of choices. So, I mean, she couldn't exactly go back to work full time and get daycare. So in any case, she starts promoting all these artworks, and it's indeed her that is responsible for Vincent van Gogh. If you ever get a chance to see Private Life of a Masterpiece, there's a whole section on the promotion of Sunflower. She held that back for the longest time. That was something that was dear to her, and so she held that back for a long time until she finally sold it. In his last days, he was prolific, painting around 70 paintings in 70 days. I wish. But yes, I mean, that's a lot of painting. This is a gorgeous work when you see it in person, when you see it in the museum. Again, it has that thick impasto. It's long and narrow. It is not his last work. It is one of those things that a lot of people perceive of as his last work, but it isn't his last work. But there are crows, and he died in a wheat field, and it fits, and it's kind of a nice way to end this lecture. Well, so what? That's not the truth of the matter. Most likely, his last work was Daubigny's Garden. The curator at the Van Gogh Museum says that it's tree roots. The point is, they're not entirely sure. You can say it's one of the last works, but it's not the last work. Certainly, it is not one of the two new works he mentions in the letter he wrote 4 days before he died. So, yes, it has crows that are death imagery, but again, he didn't always follow the rules. This is Daubigny's Garden. Charles Daubigny was an important artist, and he was an artist of contemporary life, art of the time period. He's not painting mythology. He's not painting historical images. He's painting true life. He's often painting the lower classes as well, which is another thing Vincent van Gogh admired. Or was it this one? We don't know. In any case, I think he was a really interesting man, and I'll put a few clips online, and I recommend you watch them. So thank you.